Hi, friends, and welcome. Thanks for joining us again this week. And speaking of this week, our adventure this time takes us down the yellow brick road all the way down to Fredonia, Kansas. We're headed back to hunt with our good friend Ed Barton of B&C, Kansas. And if you're a frequent flyer, you know this is one of the places I absolutely look forward to going. In fact, last year, at the 11th hour, I was able to get a look at a dandy buck. That was a great hunt and a great deer, and I'm truly hoping that history repeats itself, with the possible exception of that 11th hour thing. Yeah, my nerves could do without that. Still, I know this part of Kansas gives up some great deer, and I also know that the rut is just now winding down, at least the first phase, and I'm hopeful that that'll put the bucks back on the prod, cruising and looking for the last few receptive does. I'm also hopeful that we can get one of them in front of us in just 3 or 4 days. That's all the time we have before Thanksgiving rolls around and we have to get in the truck and head it up home. So, without further ado, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed down to Kansas looking for a cruiser right now. We hadn't even made it to our stand yet when I noticed movement coming right at us. Why do I love Kansas? We weren't even in the tree yet, and we were already seeing deer. Seeing that youngster on his feet in the middle of the day as we walked into that stand was exactly what I'd hoped for. It was almost Thanksgiving, and in my mind at least, the rut had already peaked. That meant the bucks would be back up on their feet in search mode, looking for those last few receptive does. And that meant we'd have a better than average chance of getting in front of one, at least in my mind. Once we actually got up into our stand, I started looking around and everything looked the same as when I had hunted here last year. And it didn't take long before I noticed the reason we call this the possum stand, at least I do. I've hunted a number of places down here, but this little out-of-the-way spot is certainly one of my favorites. And I was truly hopeful it'd hold the same magic it had for me last year. And just before sunset, the second buck of our trip was working his way in up toward the feeder. This pudgy little forked horn came bouncing across the dry creek bed and marched right straight up in front of us like he owned the place. He made it all the way up to right in front of us, but he never really settled in. He had only been there for a second when he turned and looked. This was no pudgy little forked horn. This was a dandy buck cruising across down along the edge of the old fence. I couldn't tell for sure he was an 8 or a 10 point, but either way he was definitely a shooter. I tried grunting a little bit, and it got his attention. He turned and started coming. And then the little buck turned and went out to him. I don't know what the deal was there. It was a submissive thing or something, but when the little buck went out there, the big guy just stood there looking for a few seconds. And then, satisfied, I guess, he turned and kept right on cruising. He started heading back the way he'd come. I did try a couple of more grunts, but it didn't seem to matter. That was a good buck. Unfortunately, as you saw, he didn't come all the way in. Ed runs feeders at most of his stands, and the fact that the bucks weren't coming in to even feed a little made me believe that they were definitely back in the cruise mode, searching for the last few does. And then, what I saw that evening made me sure of it. I sat there just watching this doe. She never did come over to try and feed. She just kept circling, staring in all different directions. She was out there by where the bucks had crossed the fence earlier, and I knew she was standing there trying to attract attention. It's just one of those things. You spend enough time in the stand, you start to notice things. Her fawns were coming in, they were feeding, but she never did. She just stood out there kind of showing off like gals will do sometimes, and then she turned and slowly started walking away. I looked over, and here come a little buck walking right straight at her. The doe and one of her fawns slowly moved off to the north, but the buck didn't follow. He walked up across the dry creek bed and then just stood there staring back the way he'd come. And then I saw the reason why. This appeared to be a 2-year-old buck, and from his busted rack I figured he was obviously a fighter. He came in, laid his ears back, tipped his head at the other buck, and that was all it took to run that forked horn off. This buck actually did come all the way in. He actually made it up to the feed and stood there getting a few mouthfuls of corn. But even he was only there for a couple of minutes. It was getting dark and he kept looking over his shoulder, and then finally he grabbed one more mouthful of grub and headed off after that doe. Obviously not a shooter, at least not yet. Still, I learned a little from that buck. He told me that there were enough bucks in the area that there were some serious fights going on to establish pecking order. He also told me that the buck that broke his antlers considered this part of the world home, and that was the deer we were hoping to see. Not long after first light the next morning, the exact same doe, or one just like it, was doing the exact same thing. She dropped her button buck fawn off at the feeder, and then she worked her way out to that bend in the creek. This time she actually crossed it and was just out there loitering again, looking around, going to the exact same spot that we'd seen the buck come from. Friends, this isn't a coincidence. This is behavior. Does do go looking for bucks when they're ready to breed, and if you can find the spot where that happens, well, let's just say this stand wasn't here by accident. That button buck stayed down in front of us for quite some time as the doe worked her way out and around, but eventually came right back to the exact same spot at this bend in the creek, and then slowly worked her way off to the north again. Friends, I can't stress enough how important it is to pay attention to these small details. If you want to hunt mature deer, especially with archery gear, these are the kind of things that are the difference makers. Knowing where the does go to find the bucks, that's the kind of information I want on a rut hunt. What appeared to be the same doe as yesterday was back in the area, just loitering around. She wasn't coming in to feed. She'd drop her fawns off there, but then she'd just kind of stand out there like she was waiting for something. Now, I've seen this behavior before in does that are just coming into their breeding cycle, and I figured sooner or later she was going to pull in a buck. I'm pretty sure that's why she was there. About a half hour later, I was doing some grunting, and this spike buck came popping up out of the creek bed, worked his way across, and stood there right in front of our scent station. He tested the wind for several minutes and then grabbed a mouthful of corn. And then he too went off cruising down the creek bed. we may not have gotten an up-close look at a bona fide shooter yet. But everything we were seeing told me this was the right place to find one. And then another buck. This too a youngster came cruising down along the old fence. He came right to where the other bucks generally crossed the fence, sniffed around a little bit, stared over our way for another second or two, and then, he too backed up and just cruised on down the edge. Sooner or later, the right buck was going to show up, and when he did, hopefully, we'd still be sitting here waiting on him. Even the young bucks were just stopping by, checking for does. They weren't coming in to eat. That meant the cruise phase was definitely back on, and that told me that rattling and calling would again be working a little better. At least that's what I was telling myself when I reached over and picked up the bones and started banging them. And not 2 minutes into my first rattling session, a decision came popping up out of the creek bed. I grabbed up my bow. I could see this was a more mature animal. He didn't look that big, but he didn't look that small either. I did notice he had a small flap of skin hanging down by his hock on his right hind leg. He probably caught it jumping a barbed wire fence or something, but it didn't seem to be bothering him any. I stood there trying to decide. I remember thinking, boy, he seems more than a little nervous. And then he circled our scent station and then turned and started walking out. Yeah, I passed. He worked his way around and stopped in a scrape, and I remember sitting there thinking as he trotted off looking for some girls, that might have been a mistake. That was either a really good 2-year-old or a 3-year-old that was a little run down, a little thinned out by the rigors of the rut. Either way, as I stood there deciding to wait, I knew that might well be my one close encounter on this trip, the one chance at a mature animal I hope to get on every archery hunt, and I had just decided to pass it. And not 10 minutes after that 7-point left, and another young buck came working his way back in the other direction. There were definitely bucks up and cruising. This certainly wasn't a shooter, wouldn't be for a long time, but the deer were on their feet. It was already the middle of the morning. All of this kept giving me assurance that sooner or later, the right buck was going to stop by. After seeing that older buck and then that forked horn still on their feet looking around for girls, I decided we were going to hunt a little longer. It was certainly cold enough, and I've had some pretty good luck hunting late into the morning, a lot later than a lot of people will stay on stand. It's worked for me in the past, and I was hoping sticking it out might be the answer this day. And just before lunchtime, I recognized a familiar button buck, followed by a familiar doe working their way in up under the fence. Only the doe stopped after the button buck crossed to head toward the feeder. Again, she just stood there milling, looking around, and then she turned a couple of tight circles as if she was measuring the fence, getting ready to jump. But she didn't, and she didn't go under. She did look over her left shoulder for a second, and then she made an immediate right turn and started heading straight away from us. And then the reason why popped up out of the creek bed. I immediately reached over and grabbed my bow. The doe had only gone about 20 yards, so I had to ever so slowly work my way around. He was going to cross out at about 30-35 yards. and he was definitely the kind of mature buck I'd come to Kansas hoping to get a look at. He stood there, nervously testing the wind. He was slightly quartering in and looking more or less right at us. I didn't dare try to draw, I'd just have to wait it out. Sooner or later, he'd have to turn, either to leave or to follow the doe, and when he did, he put his head down and I turned a little further shot. In this chess game, you only get one wrong move. More than once I saw him twitch as if he was about to blow out of there. And then finally, okay, what happened there was the deer jumped, and the camera guy jumped, and he took a couple of hops and then just stood there looking around. Yeah, after standing there just watching that buck look around and then walk off. Yeah, I got to go for a little walk of my own. Missing is missing. Nobody likes it. Certainly not me. But I have to tell you, if you want to be me, if you want to do what I do, you have to learn to deal with it. You have to compartmentalize. What you have to do is have a short memory. So, after taking the appropriate amount of time to kick myself, we got back to it. Late that afternoon, we did see our old friends, the doe and her button buck, working their way down in front of the stand. I kept waiting and watching, figuring, that big boy's going to be following her. He's got to be here somewhere. She was being more than a little nervous, stood out away from the bait for a long time, and I thought, any minute now. And then she came in, cruised on past the bait, and headed back out in the other direction. I never did see that big boy following her. I don't know where he went, but he wasn't here. We did see a few does that afternoon, but I'll admit, while I sat there waiting for it to get light the following morning, and I was still kicking myself a little bit, I meant what I said. On an archery hunt for wild whitetails, even in a place as good as Kansas, you just don't get very many opportunities. Early the next morning, our last in Kansas, a group of 4 or 5 does and fawns were working their way down through the creek bed, more or less in our direction. I kept watching. Surely a buck would be following them. And one was, sort of. A little forked horn was pushing this group of girls around. I remember thinking, a bigger buck is going to show up and take over this harem. But none did, at least not while we could see. The sun was already up on our last day in the stand, and other than that little forked horn, we hadn't seen much, so I decided before I called it quits, I was going to try a little more rattling, some grunting, anything and everything. This was the last day. I was right in the middle of some rattling when I noticed a big boy coming back up the fence in our direction. I couldn't tell if this was the buck from the day before, but it was definitely another shooter, a mature buck. All I needed now was for him to work his way down in here, and I was going to get another chance. I grunted a couple of times and he turned left. He was angling in our direction. And then And then he saw something, another doe, I guess, out in the field, because he turned around and started trotting back out into the open. My chance at redemption just ran off the other way. Last morning, last chance, pulling a beautiful buck. And he just, like old bucks do, he saw something, he sensed something, I don't know. 70 yards out there, he just pulled up and said, "Nah, I don't see him." Well, what are you going to do? Can't make him come. What? I don't know. I guess if you could, it wouldn't be any fun. But I want to thank Ed again. Certainly thank you, Tom. It's been a great hunt. We have seen a bucket full of deer. Had one or two interesting encounters. And that right there, that's the reason you come to Kansas. That was a monster. Well, T, coming home. That's about it. From Kansas, without a deer, that's a wrap. Still, it was a great hunt. Another tremendous buck, but as you saw, he just wouldn't commit. I found myself wishing I'd put up a decoy or something for him to see. Still, in the end, I had to just sit there and watch him walk away. That's the way it is, like I told you. Generally, you get one good chance. And I can tell you, even though I was going home without a deer, I had plenty of excitement and opportunity on this trip, and I was pretty certain we'd still be talking about it. Yeah, come our expo in January. Talking about it, by the way, is code for giving me a hard time, teasing me, because I know Ed and certainly Tom, who did the great camera work on this trip, are going to have plenty to say about it for a while yet to come. Hey, I hope you get out there. I hope you try everything you can try and hit or miss. I hope you have a good time and good people to share it with, and who knows, we might see you out there somewhere, and if we do, well, you can bet we're going to stop, help you drag yours in, and then share that cup in a fire. And if we don't see you out there, friends, well, then I'll wait for you right back here so we can share another adventure from my wilderness journal.